I've always been interested in insects, as I guess many of you have. My earliest insect memory is of collecting cinnabar caterpillars from some groundsel on the edge of the school playground when I was only about 5 or 6 years old, sticking them in my lunchbox and bringing them home. And I think I probably killed quite a few, but some eventually survived and turned into the adult moths, which, as you know, are beautiful things. And I thought that was magic, and I've been hooked ever since, and I've been lucky enough to make a career out of insects. Actually, I think most kids given half a chance are pretty excited by insects. But this is my youngest son a few years ago now, and he hates my using this picture. But there he is with his pet cockchafer, Colin. Sadly, Colin is no longer with us, but Seth is still pretty enthusiastic about insects, although he's now a teenager. Um, but but the reality is most people think us insect enthusiasts are a bit weird. Most adults are frightened of insects, as far as I can tell. Their reaction, if any insect flies near them, is usually one of fear. They flap around, they try and kill it, they think it's going to bite them or sting them or something. And I think that's terribly sad. And I guess my sort of self-appointed mission in life is to try and persuade people to like or love insects. We've got a long way to go, it must be said. As exemplified by this. I this was taken on the University of South Wales campus a couple of summers ago. Top half is in Welsh, so I'm guessing very few of you can read it, but the English translation is pretty clear. Warning, flying insects in this area. Run for your life. There might be a butterfly or a honeybee or a bumblebee or a beetle or whatever. It's just ridiculous. All it was, in fact, was some swarming ants. And yet somebody thought that was sufficiently terrifying that they needed to put up warning signs so that people could avoid the whole area. It's just bonkers. Anyway, I'm sure you'll all agree with me. Insects are actually pretty cool, amazingly beautiful, nothing to be frightened of on the whole. And so let me just give you, if in case you don't know the sort of backstory of insects, let me just tell you a bit more about them. Insects have been around for a really long time. They first appeared about 480 million years ago, which um, is makes them twice as old as the earliest dinosaurs. Um, they were the first creatures to sing on our planet, almost certainly, and they were the first creatures to fly. In fact, they had the skies to themselves for about 170 million years until the pterosaurs finally arrived. Um, and because they've been around so long, they've had time to speciate into this incredible diversity of forms and shapes and colors and weird life cycles and so on, just a tiny few of which are on the screen now. Um, we've named well over 1 million species of insects so far, which means they comprise about two-thirds of all known species on our planet that we've so far formally named. But new insects are discovered all the time, and what's really cool, I think, is that scientists have estimated how many insects we haven't yet found, which is pretty tricky, and they argue a lot about the answer. But most scientists agree that there's probably somewhere between another 3 and 8 million insect species on our planet that we haven't yet seen, which is just amazing to think, what other creatures are out there waiting for us to discover them. Anyway, I thought I'd start off with in a very gentle way by just showing you some cool insects, so that we can all marvel at how cute and endearing they are in their various ways. Starting with a common European insect, the acorn weevil. They must be having a good year this year because it's been an astonishingly good year for acorns. The reason I put this up, aside from the fact that it's a rather sweet little insect, is weevils are the most successful family of any creature on the planet. If I remember correctly, there are 90,000 known species of weevil so far. And there are a family within the beetles. They all tend to share in common having a little down curved sort of snout at the end of their head, although in the acorn weevil it's particularly pronounced, and I think it's a rather splendid little creature. Insects on the whole are one common feature of many of them is that they're camouflaged to avoid being eaten because insects are a favored prey for a huge diversity of larger creatures, as we'll come back to later. Um, and this is just one of the more astonishing examples of insect camouflage that I've come across. This, if you're probably trying to sort of twist your head to work out what you're looking at. You're looking at it is not a British insect. This is a Bornean bush cricket, which lives and feeds on a tree which has these sort of pinkish leaves with green veins, which you can see in the background. But the thing in the main object is the cricket itself. So its eye is down here on the right, and this is the wing, the modified forewing, and these are the legs, and you can see the hind legs are sort of modified to look like little leaflets. Astonishing creature. I have to say I've not actually seen it myself, but I'd love to one day. Continuing the camouflage theme, of course, moths spend their days, most of them hiding trying to avoid being eaten, waiting for it to get dark when they can get active. This is a photograph I took in Ecuador a few years ago of the forest floor near a light on a little forest cabin which had been attracting moths in the night. And if this were a live event, I'd challenge people to see how many moths they can count in that photograph. I think there's 7 or 8. Some of them easier to spot than others, but I don't have a definitive answer off the top of my head. But anyway, there's quite a few. One of the better camouflaged ones is there in the middle. Anyway, of course, some insects do the opposite. They're very brightly coloured. They're not at all trying to camouflage themselves. And this is another mechanism to avoid being eaten. This is just it's called aposematism by scientists, or just warning coloration. This is a garden tiger moth. Used to be a common species in Britain, but sadly, much less common than it was when I was a kid. But anyway, its coloration is to warn that it's poisonous. There's no point in being poisonous if the bird only finds out that after it's bitten you in half. So a lot of poisonous insects, they sequester poisons from their larval food plant and then advertise that they're toxic, much like the cinnabar moth that I mentioned earlier. But the garden tiger has another trick because it's active at night when it might be eaten by bats, which can't obviously see the warning colours. But when it hears the echolocation calls of a bat closing in on it, um, it emits a special buzz, which bats quickly learn to recognize as it's a poisonous garden tiger moth, so they don't bother attacking, they veer off at the last second. So it's a kind of oral equivalent of the bright colors. Another trick insects have is to mimic dangerous insects when in fact they're harmless. I'm sure you've come across this. This is a fly pretending to be a bumblebee. It's called the bumblebee hoverfly. It's quite a common insect. I get these in my garden in Sussex. Um, Beautiful insects and sufficiently good mimics that they fool most people who aren't insect aficionados at least. Of course, the reason they're pretending to be a bee is the bee has a sting, and lots of predators will avoid trying to tackle something that they think has got a sting. But of course, the fly actually has no sting at all. It's completely harmless and good to eat. Um, just a couple more in my tour of the insect world. Some of you may recognize this. It's a British insect, but it's pretty rare in Britain. I've never seen one here, but I've seen them in the south of Spain, where they're quite common. It's a bombardier beetle. Has a really extraordinary defense against attack. It when it's under attack, it squeezes chemicals into a reaction chamber in its sort of rear end, which creates a chemical reaction which produces this blast of nearly boiling benzoquinones, which are basically toxic chemicals, really caustic, which it can direct that blast. You can see it in this instance, a scientist is prodding it with a needle, and you can see it's directed the blast. So it has a prehensile anus essentially that it can use to fire this hot liquid in any direction it chooses. Amazing little creatures. What else have we got? Some insects are just plain weird, and we have no idea at all why they look like what they look like, as it were. This is a little leafhopper from Central America, which exudes coloured wax strands from its bottom. Um, and we have absolutely no idea why it does that, what purpose that could possibly serve. Must do something useful because it looks like an enormous burden. Hopefully one day we'll find out. And finally, there's even a shield bug that lives in Thailand, which looks a bit like Elvis. Isn't that an amazing creature? Presumably not deliberate mimicry. Anyway, that's just a little canter to warm you up. A few of the weird and wonderful world of insects. Um, Getting on to more serious stuff. Of course, the title of my talk is saving our insects. And the reason they need saving is because they're not doing very well. At least many of them are not. I'm going to give you a few examples of the evidence we have. It is patchy. I should be the first to admit we don't have good monitoring schemes for many insects, and there are whole regions of the world where we have no data at all on how insects are doing, like, for example, Africa, which is a major knowledge gap. But anyway, um, what I'm showing you here, this is a graph from quite a famous study that was conducted in Germany um, by entomologists who put Malaise traps. There's a Malaise trap top right, which catch all flying insects. And what the chart is showing you is the weight of insects caught per trap per day. The traps were on nature reserves scattered across Germany, and they started trapping in 1989. So the chart is the biomass of flying insects per trap per day from 89 to 2016, 17, I think, actually. Uh, and you can see the weight fell. I mean, the average catch fell by 76% in a little over a quarter of a century on German nature reserves, which is really concerning. And so far as we can tell, there's nothing particular happening in Germany that makes it special. We think this is probably representative of what's happening elsewhere, more or less. Um, so a rather different example. My specialization is bumblebees. I've spent nearly 35 years now chasing around after bumblebees. Um, and this is one of my favorites, the shrill carder bumblebee, Bombus sylvarum. Um, Very handsome little bees with a high-pitched buzz, hence the name. Um, but you can see on the left there the distribution of this bee pre-1960, but it's sadly been in rapid decline over time. Um, so I became really interested in why trying to understand why bumblebees were declining about 25 years ago. I was based at the University of Southampton at the time, and I went looking for the shrill carder. I'd never seen one um, in the summer of 2000, and I found some on the nearest population was Salisbury Plain at the time. I remember getting really excited when I finally heard one of these little high-pitched beasts buzzing around. Um, but there weren't very many, and actually that Salisbury Plain population has gone extinct since 2000. And very recently, the population on Somerset Level seems to have fizzled out. So this bee within my lifetime has gone from being pretty common and widespread in England and Wales to extinct in Britain in the next decade, if we're not careful. So this has happened on our watch, in our lifetime, and it's still happening. It's ongoing. Every year, things seem to get worse for this poor bee, despite the best efforts of Bumblebee Conservation Trust and other organisations. One more example, which I think is really interesting. If you put an ultraviolet light out in the tropics, in rainforest or other tropical habitats, you can often get, or you used to be able to get at least, an extraordinary variety of insects attracted. Um, So this is a photograph of a white sheet next to some UV lights um, in Guanacaste National Park in Costa Rica. Um, that was 1984. If we skip on to exactly the same position, the same trap in 2019, and this isn't just taken on a really bad night. They trap every night, and this is now typical at the best time of year for insect catching. It's pretty sad, isn't it? I mean, you just flick back. There's some astonishing creatures on here. I would have loved to have had a chance to look at some of those. All sorts of beautiful hawk moths and silk moths and beetles and still a few interesting creatures there, but it's a dismal catch compared to what they used to get. Yeah, so that it seems that we've been living through this massive decline of insects, but most people haven't really noticed anything because most people don't care. They're not interested. They're not bad people. It's just not on their radar. Um, but there is, of course, one thing which is gets endless discussion, which I think almost everybody has noticed, or at least if you might need to jog their memory to make them even think about it. But if you're old enough, and exactly how old you need to be is debatable. But there was a time when if you drove any distance in the summer, you literally had to stop every few hours if it was a reasonably sunny day to clean your windscreen because it would be covered in splattered bugs, poor things. Um, but as the cartoonist has drawn today, you don't have that problem. You might get one or two, but it's been decades since I've ever felt the need to stop to clean a windscreen. Um, exactly when it switched from one to the other, I'm sure it wasn't sudden. I guess it was gradual, and we didn't really notice it until we thought about it years later. Anyway, the cartoonist has gone on to project what that might mean, and although I guess it's meant to be humorous, there's a serious side to this, obviously. Um, the cartoonist is suggesting that if the insects go, then we're going to go. Um, and there's certainly a point there because insects are, of course, hugely important. They're not just a nice to have. They're vital to the way ecosystems work. And if you don't need, you probably already know all this, but forgive me for going through it. I'm just going to run through why insects matter. So I've already sort of touched on this. Lots of things eat insects. So if insects are declining in abundance in the way we think they are, that means less food for a huge array of birds, bats, freshwater fish like trout and salmon, um, amphibians and reptiles, and pretty much everything. Most larger vertebrates, or a huge number of them, feed on insects. So if the insects go, then they're going to go. Um, but insects aren't just important as food, of course. Um, they perform all sorts of other, what are often called ecosystem services, things like controlling crop pests, the ladybird, the hoverfly, the earwig, the lacewing larvae down the bottom there, and so on. And insects are involved in recycling of nutrients. So things like the dung beetle, top right there, plays a really important role, along with a whole host of hundreds of other species of dung, fly, and beetle in recycling animal dung and releasing the nutrients back into the environment for plants to grow. And carrion beetles, the red and black beetle in the middle there, along with blowflies and whatnot, help to recycle dead bodies, again, releasing the nutrients. And that's really important stuff. It's all pretty unglamorous. Um, but if it didn't happen, we'd really notice it. We just take it all for granted. The only thing I think that is widely known about that most people, even those not interested in insects, have heard of, is what these insects are doing, of course, which is pollination. I'm sure that needs no introduction to any of us. Um, it's important to stress that pollination isn't just done by bees, much as I love them. Um, uh, it's uh, it's done by thousands of different species of insect. Butterflies, of course, and moths, and lots of different species of flies and beetles and wasps, and some other insects besides. And between them, they pollinate Well, so 87% of all plant species on the planet need pollinating by some kind of animal. And in the tropics, that's occasionally done by birds and or very rarely by bats, but nearly all of that 87% is delivered by insects of one sort or another. So without insects, most plant species would ultimately disappear because they wouldn't be able to reproduce. And of course, as we all know, there's a direct link to us at this point. Um, we've become used to having this amazing array of fruits and veg available to us. Um, when we go to the supermarket or the grocers or whatever. Um, but most of those fruit and veg wouldn't give a good yield um, without being pollinated. So that includes apples, cherries, strawberries, raspberries, tomatoes, chili peppers, melons, you name it. Even coffee and chocolate are reliant on insect pollination. So imagine a world without those. Doesn't bear thinking about. And obviously, it would be extremely difficult to feed everybody in the world and certainly to give them a healthy diet with enough vitamins and minerals and so on, without the crops which are pollinated by insects. So we need to make sure we don't end up like these folk. You may have seen these pictures before, but taken in southwest China, where there's an area of a big area of apple and pear orchards. Um, where there are so few pollinators left, we think largely due to very high levels of pesticide use. Um, so that the farmers now go out in blossom time in the spring and they hand pollinate the flowers themselves, and they get their kids to climb up to to the tops of the trees to reach the flowers that the parents can't get to. This is economically viable in for this crop, which is quite a high value crop, and in China where labor is relatively cheap. Um, but it's hard to imagine a European farmer hand pollinating a field of oilseed rape, for example. So um, we need to ensure that we don't end up in the same situation. So insects are uh, vitally important. So, and for selfish reasons, we need to look after them. Otherwise, we're going to go hungry. Um, and that is all true, and an argument I've trotted out umpteen times over the years. Um, and maybe for some people it's the best argument, but it does leave me feeling slightly hollow because it doesn't really capture why I care about insects and want to stop them declining. I do it because I like them and I think they're really cool. And it worries me that there are probably loads of insects that don't perform an ecosystem service that benefits mankind. Um, and do we not worry about those? Can they all just go extinct? That seems like a bit of it seems like a very self-centered way to view the world. Just to give you an example that might make sense of my ramblings, um, here is the St. Helena giant earwig. It's the biggest earwig that ever lived, so far as we've yet discovered, at least. It was about 7 centimeters long, so it was a big old insect. Amazing forceps at the back there. Anyway, it lived on St. Helena, tiny island in the South Atlantic, very remote. Lived in seabird colonies, scavenging for food. Sadly, it's extinct. It's pretty certain that there are none left. It hasn't been seen for about 60 years now, despite expeditions in search of it. Seems like it was probably eaten by rats that we accidentally introduced to the island. Um, but there was no ecological catastrophe unfolded when the earwig went extinct. It wasn't doing anything vital. Um, but isn't the world a sadder place for not having a giant earwig in it, even though none of us were ever going to go and see this beast? It seems to me that earwig had as much right to survive as we do, and we should not just value insects for what they do for us, but just to value them for being organisms that we share our planet with. Um, anyway, I'm probably rambling a bit too much at this point. Let me move on. Um, so, if we're going to save our insects, we need to know why they're declining. Um, it's complicated, as I'm sure you understand. There isn't a single factor to blame that's driving insect declines around the world. It's actually a perfect storm of adverse forces that we've created, and it's important to know that we have created them. These are all things that we have done. Um, Loss of habitat is globally still probably one of the biggest drivers, and in the UK has played a huge role. For example, we've lost about 97% of our lowland species-rich grasslands, our hay meadows, and so on, in the 20th century, which which is why the shrill carded bumblebee that I showed you pictures of earlier has declined so much because that's where it used to live. Um, Anyway, but there are lots of other drivers, pesticides, which are a kind of integral part of industrial agriculture these days, have undoubtedly played a role, and I'll come back to them later. Um, but there are lots of others too, and I won't go through all these. Um, uh, and probably things we haven't even thought of yet contributing to declines, which is why there's a load of question marks at the bottom. Um, Anyway, so insects have lots of problems. What can we actually do about them? Um, well, there are lots of things I'm sure you could suggest, but I've put down some of the things that I think are most important, or uh, I'm personally most interested in here. One of the biggest issues is how do we find a way to feed everybody in the world without doing terrible damage to the environment in the process and potentially undermining the very system that's feeding us. I personally think the industrial farming model that we've gone down is not sustainable. It's a huge contributor to greenhouse gases. It's doing terrible damage to soils and it's wiping out biodiversity. So it's a real challenge there to work out, how do we grow food differently in a truly sustainable way, and in a way that doesn't harm wildlife. But I'm leaving that for another day, because it's a huge subject that I can't just um, properly address in the time I have. We also might rewild areas. This has become a hugely trendy approach to conservation in recent years, and it's one that I am a big fan of. I have to say, the Net project is quite close to me, and I go there fairly often, and I think it's really amazing to see how nature can spring back, given a bit of space and time to itself. Um, but I don't have a big estate. Most of us don't have a farm or an estate we can rewild, but lots of us do have access to some kind of small garden or other sort of outdoor space that we can use to support insects. And this is something that's much more accessible to many more people. I know not everybody has. Some people do live in a flat without any balcony or roof terrace, and if you do, then that's a shame. But there are still things you can do, and I'll try to remember to touch on those. But those of us lucky enough to have a garden can do a lot for insects. Um, because there's a lot of us. There are about 22 million private gardens in the UK. Just imagine if they were all insect friendly or wildlife friendly, full of wildflowers and pesticide free and so on. Um, they cover a collective area of well over 500,000 hectares, which is a bigger area than all of our national nature reserves by far. And imagine too, just suppose we could get the council on board so that the parks were full of wildflowers, the cemeteries, the road verges, the roundabouts, and so on. That would be a national network of insect-friendly habitat, and that would really make a difference. And it's not just a kind of pie in the sky dream either. It's achievable. It's actually already happening, and there are loads of people trying to make their gardens more wildlife friendly right now. Um, so it's kind of exciting to be part of, and I think we need to speed up that process and try and win over ever more people to the cause. As you can tell, this is something I'm quite into. I've written, sorry for plugging my own books again, but I have written some books about it if you want more info, and made lots of YouTube videos about how to make your garden more wildlife friendly. So how do you make your garden more wildlife friendly? Well, there's obviously a huge amount here that I could talk about, um, and we haven't got time for everything by any means. But let's start with what not to do. Um, this is my idea of hell. Sadly, now, according to a recent survey, 8% of English gardens now have a plastic lawn. God help us. Um, It's just depressing. I could rant at length why that's a bad thing. I'm hoping you don't need me to convince you. Um, you can even these days get plastic hedging. That's a plastic box hedge, which I suppose has the advantage it doesn't get attacked by box moth. But but talk about sort of disconnect from nature. It's tragic. You can even get um, special shampoo for your lawn, for your plastic lawn, I should say, um, that promises to make it smell like a real wildflower meadow. What are we doing? I do sometimes think the human race has badly lost its way. Um, I came across there was a tweet a couple of years ago now by some guy with a plastic lawn who was asking in all seriousness on Twitter if anyone had any suggestions, because he had this problem that his neighbor had a cherry tree and the blossom was falling off the tree and landing all over his plastic lawn, and he was having to hoover it every day to get rid of the petals. And he wanted to, anyway, moving on. So I'm guessing few people on this call have a plastic garden. But we're probably all, I'm certainly guilty of slightly less obvious sort of environmental harms associated with the way I garden. It's hard to resist. Um, if you're a gardener, you've probably been to a garden centre and you probably got a trolley in the spring, maybe got some annual bedding plants in disposable plastic pots, probably grown in the peat-based compost, probably sprayed with lots of pesticides, and you chuck them in the top, and then you might get a sack of peat-based compost and stick that in the bottom, and you might get some bug clear for the spraying the aphids on the roses, and some Roundup to spray the weeds on the drive. And garden centres are basically full of stuff that's really bad for the environment. It's a whole industry of selling us tat that does more harm than good on the whole. And yet it's so tempting. The plants look so beautiful. I can't blame people for getting drawn in. But we should be aware of those harms. The flip side is that gardens can be amazing places for wildlife. And there's this lovely example from Leicester, this lady, Jenny Owen, who spent 35 years cataloguing the wildlife of her small urban garden. Um, uh, top marks for endurance, persistence. After 35 years, her species list was amazing. 2,673 different species of animals and plants. I don't know whether she included fungi in that. In her garden, 1,997 of them were different types of insects. So thousands of species can live in a small urban garden. I think that's astonishing. Wouldn't it be great if we all had gardens like that with thousands of species living in them? I think that's really kind of inspiring. So how do you get so many species in a garden? As I say, I haven't really been waffling on. I haven't got time to go into all the many things you can do to encourage wildlife in a garden. But I'm going to touch on a few things which I think are perhaps the more important. Um, Firstly, there's pretty solid scientific evidence that on the whole, where possible, growing native plants is better than non-natives. And I'm not suggesting you rip up all the non-natives in your garden. I know that's not at all realistic. Um, but there have been a number of studies, including the title of which is at the bottom there that I was involved in, some by the RHS as well, which have shown that on average, native plants tend to be a bit more attractive than non-natives, with some prominent exceptions. But on the whole, they're pretty good. And examples include, for example, that these are some of the best pollinator attractors amongst our native flora. Marjoram on the left there is it's not the most stunning flower in the world, but it's incredibly attractive to a whole range of insects, bees, flies, butterflies, and so on. Viper's bugloss in the middle is a beautiful, not quite so common, but a beautiful biennial that's very easy to grow in most gardens. Um, and then you've got greater knapweed, bottom right. I could have added bird's foot trefoil as well to this list, because I could have added lots of plants to this list, but bird's foot trefoil is also fabulous. Um, but actually, attracting pollinators is not the main advantage of growing native plants. The main advantage is that you're providing food for herbivorous insects, not pollinators, but insects that eat the leaves of the plants. which tend to be much fussier about what they'll eat. And as butterfly enthusiasts, you will know all about this because butterflies are a really familiar example of just how fussy herbivorous insects are. The female butterflies will usually lay their eggs on one or two host plant species which are suitable for their caterpillars to eat. And this I'm sure you all instantly recognize the orange tip butterfly, beautiful spring flying butterfly that we might see in a few months' time. It's pretty fussy. It'll lay its eggs on a couple of different species of cabbage family plant, including lady's smock there on the bottom right. If you grow its food plants, there's a really good chance that you'll get butterflies laying their eggs in your garden and you'll be able to watch the caterpillars grow and so on. Your own little population of this beautiful insect. If you don't grow the food plants, there is zero chance that it will breed in your garden because that's all it will eat. And every native plant is the food plant of some insects, some just a handful, some hundreds. Particularly trees, some of our native trees can support hundreds of insect species, um, not just butterflies and moths, but also things like gall-forming wasps and leaf-mining moths and flies and a whole host of other insects besides. They're all feeding on native plants and very rarely on non-natives. And take this to an extreme. Imagine you have got room in your garden for a tree. You could go to your local garden centre and buy a eucalyptus. They're really pretty, they grow fast. Um, but unless you've got a pet koala, nothing is going to eat it. From a wildlife point of view, it's just empty space. Um, on the other hand, if you were to plant, say, an oak or an ash or a lime tree, a native deciduous tree, as it grows, it will support hundreds of species of native insect. So where you can, plant native plants, which brings me on to the subject of these plants, what are commonly described as weeds. Um, these are all native wildflowers. I'm sure you don't need me to tell you what they are. Um, they're generally regarded as undesirables in a garden. I remember my dad spending ages digging up dandelions from the lawn, trying to get the roots out and so on. Um, but if we could just question that for a minute, because these are really attractive plants for insects, for pollinators, and also things like the cinnabar moth caterpillars eating the leaves of the ragwort on the right there. I've got them all in my garden, and I don't find that they're particularly problematic at all. They don't spread. In fact, Michaelmas daisy, a non-native, is the most invasive plant in my garden. The dandelions are just fine. And if you can bring yourself to leave them, the insects will really thank you. Um, so you can get rid of all the weeds in your garden just, with the click of your fingers by reimagining them as wildflowers, because that's what they are. I came across this really lovely example from East London. There was a French lady living there who name was Sophie Le Guil, if I remember, um, who set about championing the botanical diversity growing from cracks in the pavement in East London. And she did that by chalking the names of the plants next to them to try and get passers-by to stop and look and appreciate these little plants that they'd literally been standing on and had probably never paid the slightest bit of attention to. I thought that was really sweet. Sadly, I think she's moved on, but someone should take it up again. Um, Sadly, rather than celebrating pavement weeds as she did, it's very common to see this kind of thing going on in our cities. This is, you can probably tell what it is. It was a little bit of living vegetation, probably not very botanically diverse, but it would have had some insects living in it, I'm sure. It was a little green patch of life. But now it's dead, and it's dead because many local authorities employ teams of people who drive around the streets in spring and summer looking for anything green. And if they see anything green, they jump out and spray it with herbicide and kill it, which just seems completely pointless to me. I do not understand it. It's just sort of needless environmental vandalism in the name of tidiness. But I mean, surely that doesn't look nice to anybody. Um, and I mean, aside from the obvious impact on wildlife, there is a sort of another sinister side to this, which is that the chemical they're using is almost certainly Roundup, which is based on glyphosate, which the World Health Organization says is a probable carcinogen, and there's quite strong evidence that it is. And yet we spray it in our streets, we spray it in our gardens. It's the most widely used pesticide in gardens. I've seen it being sprayed on children's play equipment in parks, which just seems utterly bonkers to me. Um, Personally, I think we should ban pesticide use entirely in urban areas. We just don't need them in gardens. I've been gardening without any chemical inputs for well over a decade now, and I don't find I miss them in the slightest. Um, and if you think it's not practical to go pesticide free in our urban areas, we've only got to look for France and look to France rather, where in 2018 they did exactly this. They banned pesticide use entirely. Gardeners can't buy pesticides. The local authority aren't allowed to buy pesticides. Only licensed farmers can actually buy pesticides in France. So Paris is pesticide free. If Paris can be pesticide free, why can't London be pesticide free? And every other urban and suburban area. Wouldn't that be great? Possibly, probably, I would guess, given the audience. Most of you, I would think, probably don't use pesticides or would use very few in your garden. I hope that's the case anyway. Um, but I just wanted to warn you about a couple of other ways you may inadvertently be bringing potent insecticides into your garden. You may well have heard of these already. And they're both things that my own research group at Sussex Uni has been working on over the years. Firstly, I mentioned earlier all those beautiful plants in the garden centre. And of course, some of them are badged up as being bee friendly or have the RHS perfect for pollinators logo attached to them, identifying them as plants that are attractive to bees and butterflies and so on. And they do that because people want to help. They want to feed the bees, attract butterflies or whatever. Um, Sadly, we tested these plants, specifically the ones being sold as bee friendly in all the big chain garden centres in the south of England, places like B&Q and Home Base and so on. We tested them for pesticides, and almost every single plant we tested contained at least one. One little heather plant had 10 different pesticides in it. 70% of the plants we tested contained things called neonicotinoid insecticides, which are really potent neurotoxins that are banned in farming now because of the harm they were doing to bees and other insects. And these are in plants being sold as bee friendly, which seems pretty outrageous and surely contravenes some kind of law. It certainly ought to. Anyway, so do beware. The other thing I wanted to flag up, which has become a bit of a hot topic in the last year or two, is um, if you have a dog or a cat, you may well be putting those neonicotinoid insecticides onto your dog or cat to protect it against fleas and ticks. So these are the two very common flea and tick treatments for dogs, cats, and rabbits as well. They're recommended. And your vet may well advise you to use these prophylactically. So even if your dog or cat doesn't actually have any ticks or fleas, it may never have had ticks or fleas, it may even be a house cat, and some vets would recommend you treat it. Um, well, the one on the left, their advocate, the active ingredient is, it says in tiny font, imidacloprid. That's a neonicotinoid insecticide. The dose you're supposed to put on a medium-sized dog is enough to give a lethal dose to 60 million honeybees, and you're supposed to put it on your dog once a month. The one on the right is the active is a slightly different compound, but it's equally potent. It's something called fipronil. Anyway, one of my PhD students, Rose Perkins, recently discovered that these chemicals are turning up in our rivers, in almost all of our rivers. In fact, 100% of rivers that are tested in England contained the compound fipronil, and 70% also contained imidacloprid. So we've got potent insecticides in all of our rivers. That can't be good, and it's all, now beyond doubt where they're coming from. We thought initially they were coming from dogs swimming in the rivers, and that is a part of the cause, but it actually turns out that's not the main route. Most of it is going down the drain from people's households. So if you wash your dog or take it to a poodle parlor, then the pesticide washes off and it goes down the drain and goes through the sewage works and straight into the river. Um, if you wash the bed, same thing happens. If you just stroke your dog and then wash your hands, some of it goes down the drain. And between those different routes, and probably others too, that's where the majority of the product ends up. Our rivers have so many pollution problems, but this is certainly not helping, having these potent neurotoxins swirling around in all of our rivers. Quite depressing. We just, I need to probably wrap up fairly soon, but just briefly, a couple of other things. Um, I'll skip that. Moving away from pesticides, let's move on. Other things you can do to make your garden insect friendly. Really simple one is not mow as much. Most people have a lawn in their garden if they have a garden. And traditionally, many people attempted to maintain something that looks like a Wimbledon tennis court with stripes up and down, mowing every couple of weeks. If you can bring yourself to leave the mower in the shed and instead get out a deck chair and make yourself a gin and tonic or whatever and sit and chill, and let the flowers spring up. It's amazing that this is my lawn and I haven't planted any flowers into it at all. These are just all things that come up because I stopped mowing, or at least I don't mow often. Um, if we could persuade everyone to mow infrequently, that would be a real bonus. In fact, the biggest single thing you can do, according to one recent scientific study, if you want to increase the number of butterfly species in your garden, a patch of long grass, it's as simple as that. Because of course there are lots of butterflies that feed on the caterpillars of which feed on grass. Whereas it's not just gardens that have lots of mown areas. There's also areas of road verge and roundabout and parks, which are all mown routinely over and over again through the spring and summer. And they don't need to be. They could be like this. This is a wildflower patch sown on a road verge that used to be mown all the time up in Scotland by a little organisation called On the Verge. Check out their website if you want to find out more. Um, but wouldn't it be amazing if every roundabout and every road verge in Britain looked like that? I think that would be really cool. I actually had a student count the insects, but and compare mown verges with these wildflower verges, and she found there were more than 50 times as many bumblebees and 13 times as many hoverflies on the wildflower strips. Not surprisingly when you look at them. So it's a good thing to sow wildflower mixes, obviously, but which ones should you sow? There are a lot to choose from, and it gets a bit bewildering if you're planning a meadow creation project. What mix should you use? Where should you get it from? I thought I'd just briefly go into this because I think it's something a lot of people struggle with. Um, there are broadly three categories of wildflower seed mix available commercially. The first of which makes me twitch, I have to say. This picture I took off the internet, this was a picture from a company that was selling what they called wildflower seeds, an English company. But I'm sure most of you have enough botanical knowledge to look at that and think, well, they're surely not all British plants, are they? There's Californian poppies and there's cosmos from Mexico and who knows what else mixed up in there. And yet they're sold as wildflowers. They do look pretty. These are mainly annual plants designed to put on a really good show and flower for a long time. And they were used around the Olympic stadiums in 2012 to great acclaim. But given what I said about the benefits of native plants, it seems a bit of a shame to me to be selling people what they think are native wildflowers when in fact they're clearly not. So I would have steer you away from those mixes, pretty though they are. A second choice, which is more native, is to sow this kind of mix, which is an arable weed mix, cornflower, corn cockle, poppies, and so on. Really pretty. Again, they're annual plants. They're kind of native. They're some people quibble about that because it's thought that they arrived with Neolithic farmers maybe 4,000 years ago. As far as I'm concerned, that's long enough that we should treat them as natives, but not everyone agrees. Anyway, uh, these are good for wildlife, but they do have the disadvantage that they need resowing every year. These are plants of disturbed land. They're not perennial meadow plants. So what I would steer you towards wherever possible, if you're planning to sow a wildflower meadow, is to obtain a perennial wildflower seed mix. It's rich in things like vetches and trefoils and clovers and so on, which once it's established, will go some way to replacing the huge area of this habitat that I mentioned earlier we lost in the 20th century. This is the habitat that's really supportive of a huge diversity of insects. And there are lots of companies that will sell you some really nice mixes. You need to buy one tailored to your soil. So if it's chalky or clay or whatever, you can get appropriate mixes. They're all slightly different. But the basic principle is you want to aim for a truly native, mainly perennial wildflower seed mix, in my opinion. Okay, I need to wrap up. I'm pretty much out of time. I just wanted to flag up the Buzz Club, which is a citizen science club trying to find out more about what makes gardens wildlife friendly and what's the best design of the Hoverfly Lagoon and Bee Hotel and so on. If you want to take part in citizen science experiments, check out the Buzz Club. If you Google it, you'll find the website. It's the one beneath the tattoo parlor in Bristol that usually comes up first. Um, so to wrap up, we live on this rock with a crust of life clinging to its surface. It is the most extraordinary thing that we very rarely stop to think about, but it's unique. There's nothing else like it in the universe. It gives us everything. Elon Musk may think that we can go and live on Mars. I wish he would go and live on Mars. But for most of us, this rock is everything we have and always will be. And I don't understand why we're not looking after it better. Why, we'd all do anything for our children apart from leave them a decent planet to live on. But I'm sure we can do better. And I think starting with looking after the little creatures that live all around us, the insects, is a pretty good place to start. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Oh, I will. One more thing. Just flagging up. In May next year, I have a new book out, Eat the Planet Well, about sustainable, ethical, planet-friendly, healthy eating. Anyway, thank you, everybody, for bearing with me. I shall just stop sharing now.
Thank you, Dave. That was brilliant. Back here again. Thank lots and lots of comments in the chat. Everybody thanking you and saying they enjoyed the talk very much. So thank you for that. If you've got time to stay on for a few questions, and I think participants will stay on as well if they start
Yeah,
voting
sorry,
with their
I,
feet.
I overran slightly and we started a couple of minutes late. So
That's no problem.
happy to hang on and answer as many questions as we can get through.
As long as people are interested, then we can stay on and answer some questions. So, Bill and Richard, do you have some questions for Dave from the chat?
Yes, so I'm just trying to extract all of the questions from the comments. So going back to Teresa, um, she says a very random question. I've read about negative impacts from dewormers used in cattle on dung beetles. Has this ever been researched when it comes to dewormers we use for our pets? And if so, are there any good alternatives?
It's not an area I know as much about as I should. There is a real problem here, which is that pharmaceuticals intended for use on domestic animals like dogs and cats. And when I say pharmaceuticals, that includes wormers and the flea treatments and anything else of that type. There's no requirement for a proper environmental risk assessment before they're registered. It was decided decades ago that um, there were so few dogs and cats that any use of chemicals on them would be insignificant, and we didn't need to worry about it. Um, Clearly, that turned out to be a really dumb decision, but it means that we don't really know what the impacts are of many of the products that are used on dogs and cats. We do know that many of the drugs used in livestock, which have been subject to a more rigorous evaluation, are really harmful to dung fauna. Things like ivermectins, which are commonly used on cattle. The dung of the cattle is more or less toxic to insect life. So presumably the same is probably true of stuff used in dogs and cats and so on. I'm afraid I can't recommend an environmentally friendly alternative. I simply don't know of one. If anyone's got any ideas, by all means, put it in the chat.
And a question from Teresa. Is the plight of pollinator declines taken as a serious food security risk by the national government?
I don't think it really is. I went to there was I don't know if any how widespread knowledge of this event was, but last week there was a thing called the National Emergency Briefing, um, which was an event put on in Westminster for specifically for MPs to bring them up to speed about the scale of the climate um, issue and biodiversity loss and the potential threat to, society and so on. Um, there were talks by a whole bunch of scientists about all of these issues, including pollinator declines, specifically delivered to a group of MPs, the ones that turned up. Um, and to be fair, there were about 80 MPs went, so that's 80 people that should know now about, the seriousness of these issues. Sadly, didn't include any government ministers that I could see at all. And from what I've seen, I don't want to start getting party political, but I've been quite disappointed by the Labour government in the last year. They don't seem to really understand the importance of nature at all. They seem to see it as a kind of nice to have. And this whole idea of painting newts and bats as the enemy of progress and growth seems to be a pretty shocking development. But anyway, so I'm rambling slightly. No really convincing answer, I'm afraid.
And a question from Veronique. Is beekeeping a problem? I've heard that because of too many hives, it's a problem for other pollinators.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, I don't want to offend any beekeepers on the call, but there is very clear evidence that there's competition. Two things. There's competition between honeybees and wild pollinators. So if you have, I mean, a single hive will have maybe 80,000 bees in it. It's a lot of mouths to feed, and they take most of the pollen and nectar from the surrounding landscape. And some beekeepers may have 10, 20, 50 hives. Um, and that impacts on, there've been rather neat studies on, for example, bumblebees showing that their nests grow slowly when they're near honeybee hives. But honeybees also act as a source of disease, which can be transmitted on via contact with flowers to wild pollinators. So for both reasons, sadly, I'm not saying we shouldn't have honeybees at all. They're really important contributors to crop pollination. I love honey, um, and they have their place. But beekeepers should be aware that you can have too many honeybees in one place, and they need to take responsibility for providing enough forage for their bees, not parasitizing other people's flowers.
And a question from Annika O'Connor. How much of the insect decline is down to not enough pollen stroke nectar? And how much is down to not enough food for the herbivorous insects that really need native plants?
Yeah, I mean, honest truth is, I think nobody could answer that question. Both are undoubtedly important, and it's certainly true that there are far fewer flowers in the landscape than there would have been historically. Um, but also fewer native wildflowers and less botanical diversity, which means less food for herbivorous insects. Which is the bigger issue? I honestly don't know. It'd be quite a tricky question to answer.
Mm.
Good question there.
A question from Marianne Jordan. How important are ponds? I have a dream that all front gardens should be turned into ponds.
Wouldn't that be great? Yes, instead of car parks. Yeah, I didn't mention ponds, but only from lack of time and because I kind of think everyone knows that ponds are amazing. Even tiny ponds are amazingly good at attracting a huge diversity of insects. So yeah. Forgive me for not mentioning ponds, but I'm with you entirely. Turn every front garden into a pond. Wouldn't that be fabulous?
And a question from Teresa. What is it about gardens that make them so special to attract a wide range of insects? Is it the diversity of plants and mini habitats versus, say, a woodland or something else, some other habitat?
Yeah, I think the question came with its own answer really. It's that diversity. There are loads of different niches in the garden. There are lots of different plants. The botanical diversity is often very high. Um, and it's not just the garden isn't a self-contained unit. It's surrounded by other gardens which will have different plants growing in them. So per acre, say, of of urban gardens, there'll be an extraordinary diversity of different plant species growing. And also compost heaps, ponds, rotting sheds, old log piles, all sorts of opportunities where insects can hibernate or nest or whatever, which means that so long as then, managed in a vaguely insect-friendly way, urban areas can be fantastic places for wildlife.
And finally, I've got a question from Hannah. Do the wooden bee posts encourage bees? Now we have several locally, which is wonderful.
I'm guessing by wooden bee posts, we're talking some kind of bee hotel, holes drilled in a wooden post, or I'm not exactly sure what a bee post is, but I'm guessing it's a bee hotel, which are great. I love bee hotels. Um, I've got about 20 on my house of various designs, basically providing horizontal holes of different sizes for a whole range of little bees. Sorry, you look like am I talking about the right thing here? We
Yep,
are.
yep.
Yeah, okay. You get mason bees in early spring and then leafcutter bees, and I get large-headed resin bees, and you get some potter wasps and all sorts of I love sitting with a coffee in the morning in the spring, watching my bee hotels to see what turns up. Whether they really make much difference to bee populations is a moot point. I don't think we know the answer, but they're great for public engagement and they're just great fun. And if anyone's interested, I mentioned briefly the Buzz Club, and we're running a big bee. It's called the Big Bee Hotel Experiment, where we're getting people to test out different designs and report how effective they are, how many residents they get. We'll be launching it for the third year again in the spring. So if you're interested, sign up.
Um, I've just quickly sort of scanned down uh, the other 40 comments which have just come in. I think I've got a question here from Elaine Lee. She asked you, how do you introduce plants to an established lawn? Is it best to grow them as plugs and plant into the turf?
Yeah, it depends how big it is and what state it's in. But you can mow it really short and sprinkle a wildflower seed mix over. You ideally do that in either September or April. And you'll get some will take, but it's not hugely effective. Um, Plug plants is probably, if it's a smallish lawn, plug plants is probably the way to go. It's a bit labor intensive, but it works.
And I've actually got a question here from Fiona Scully, uh, who I know. Um, she says Costa Rica declines. Could that be due to intensive banana plantations and the chemicals they use?
So it is a subject of considerable debate. I mean, we don't honestly know. The guy who took those moth pictures, he thinks it may be climate change, which is it's obviously starting. We're already at a degree and a bit warmer than it used to be. I struggle to believe that that alone could explain those massive declines. It's a big national park, so the banana plantations wouldn't be particularly close. So it's not obvious how significant amounts of pesticide would get into the middle of the national park, but it's possible. Um, there is some evidence that pesticides can come down, can drift long distances and even come down in rain in some conditions. So maybe it's pesticides, maybe it's climate change. Nobody knows.
Right. I think I probably scanned as many. There may still be other questions in there. I don't know, but I haven't really been able to scan all of the comments which have just come in at the end of your talk. So I think we'll hand back to Simon. Yeah.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Dave, for your answers to the questions. It's 10 minutes after time, so I think we should probably draw a halt. You should know, Dave, that you had people dialing in from California, Ireland, Guernsey, Hungary, Netherlands, Poland, Germany, Canada, Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, Australia, France, and Portugal. I think that's
Fantastic.
something of a record for any
Yeah,
talk
that's
posted so far. So
properly United Nations.
absolutely, and we're very pleased to get the message out to as many people as possible. And I think the comments you made about pesticides, about worming treatments and flea treatments, those messages need to get out there more, I think, because the dog owners and cat owners just don't know.
Mostly have no idea at all. Even
No,
vets often don't know.
no, no, no. And the veterinary profession seems to be in the stage of making things to appear to be complicated, like the tobacco and oil industry and others did in the past. So that behavior has become, I think, quite common. But we must draw a line and say thank you, Dave, very much for your
It was a pleasure.
fascinating talk. It's a pleasure to have you.